You can start, Dr. Sam.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the 53rd seminars in our seminar series at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. Today we have a very special program and very special guests, and we'll be talking about the challenges Iran is facing currently, both internally and externally. It will be a conversation style. We have two excellent guests. It's my honor to introduce Professor Muhammad Marandi. Dr. Marandi is an academic, political analyst, and expert on American studies and post-colonial literature. He's a graduate of the University of Tehran and also Birmingham University. He is also a professor of English literature at the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi has appeared as a political commentator on many international news networks. And also he serves currently in the delegation on nuclear negotiations in Vienna, what's called 5+1. We're also hoping that we will have with us Dr. Sitare Sadiqi. Dr. Sadiqi is having internet problems, but we're hoping that she will join us shortly. She's an independent researcher, translator, and teacher. She holds a PhD in American Studies from the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Her research interests include Iran-US relations, propaganda analysis, the rhetoric of social movements, among many other research interests. I'm also happy to have with me as co-host Dr. Hiba Raouf Izzat. Dr. Hiba is a political scientist. She's on the faculty of Ibn Khaldun University here in Istanbul, Turkey. Welcome, Dr. Marandi.
Thank you very much for having me.
And welcome, Dr. Raouf.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Very well. Dr. Marandi, let's start from where we are today. Everybody has been talking about what's going on in the streets of Tehran. Let us know what's going on in the streets of Tehran for the past month.
Well, first I have to point out that I am not currently an advisor to the nuclear negotiations team because there are no negotiations taking place in Vienna. During the stay in Vienna, I accompanied them and I was their media advisor like I was in 2015 for Dr. Zarif at his request, but outside of Vienna, I am just a professor at the University of Tehran.
Noted.
With regards to the events in Tehran, things have died down now. There's nothing really going on in Tehran anymore. But over the past few weeks, what we had was, I would say, an incident that was immediately turned into something other than what it was. And I think it was, it became a part of a pre-planned operation in Iran. So what do I mean by that? First of all, the United States and its allies have been strangling the Iranian economy as much as possible. They've been trying to impose and inflict as much pain and suffering on ordinary people as they possibly could. And so that, of course, itself, that pain and the suffering that accompanies the sanctions is a good tool for the United States to use in order to create discontent, and anger, and despair among at least a segment of Iranian society. On the other hand, I would then like to point out that the United States and its European allies have created a huge media apparatus that basically is directed at Iran and at ordinary Iranians. So you have...
But isn't it true that there were thousands of people in the streets?
Well, I'll get to that, but I'm contextualizing what we have. So we have a huge Persian language media apparatus that is based in the United States, in Europe, but the key media outlets are in London. In London, you have, for example, BBC Persian. You have Iran International, which is a Saudi outlet based in London. You have Manoto and a host of other media outlets. Then, as I said, we have probably more than 200 media outlets that work against Iran, which is far greater than the number of media outlets that exist inside Iran.
These are in Persian language, you're saying?
These are all in Persian language. So it is a huge apparatus. It is a huge industry, but it's state-owned. It's state-promoted, all of them. And of course, they're accompanied with Telegram channels and websites and many thousands of people are employed. Alongside, and it is very hostile towards Iran. So if you watch BBC Persian or Iran International, it is a media channel that is basically telling everyone how dark and how horrible Iran is. And basically, Iran is the most horrible place on the planet. So you have that constant 24 hours a day media, anti-Iran media operation, spreading rumors, spreading sectarian division, spreading ethnic division, spreading hatred and anger as much as possible. So you have the sanctions, then you have the media, and then you have a third weapon, as I would call it, and that is these troll farms where bots and trolls are active. You have thousands of people in one particular farm in Albania, which is a Western US funded apparatus. It belongs to the MEK terrorist organization. So the MEK terrorist organization was a group that in the 1980s murdered, I think, roughly 17,000 people in Iran through terrorist attacks. And then they joined Saddam Hussein and fought as foot soldiers for Saddam Hussein during his war against Iran. And they also helped.
This is just for our audience. This is what is referred to as Mujahideen Khalq.
Yes, the Mujahideen Khalq. And they served the Saddam's foot soldiers, and they also suppressed any opposition to Saddam as ordinary soldiers, whether in the north against the Kurds or in the south. They were an arm of the Iraqi armed forces, or Saddam.
I just want to know that Dr. Sitara Sadiq just joined us. So welcome, Dr. Sitara. All right.
Thank
Go ahead.
you.
So, and you have a large number of such troll farms across Europe and North America. But as I said, the largest is in Albania and belongs to the MEK terrorist organization. And of course, Albania is a part of NATO. So you have this huge Persian media apparatus, you have these huge troll farms and bots, and also you have the sanctions and the constant pressure on ordinary people. And of course, big tech in the United States is behind all of this. So through their algorithms, they amplify these troll farms, and they also suppress alternative voices. Just as a small example, I myself have lost my Facebook account was taken years ago, was deleted years ago, my Instagram account. So, and this has happened to many hundreds of thousands of people that are friendly to Iran or associated with Iran. And of all of the Iranian media, every single one of them are sanctioned. And all media affiliated to Iran is also sanctioned, or groups affiliated to Iran or allied to Iran. So you have Iran handicapped both at home and abroad, and you have these crippling sanctions plus this huge media apparatus and these troll farms that rule over the internet under these circumstances. Now, taking this into account, what happened about 5-6 weeks ago was that, I think, roughly 5-6 weeks ago, was that a young woman, it came out in the news that a young woman, the news coming from these Persian media outlets, was beaten and battered to death and tortured to death by what they called morality police. Of course, we don't have a term in Persian that's morality police, but we'll leave that aside for now. So even I thought that there must have, or not must have, but I thought that it's quite possible that this was an issue of police brutality, because the Persian media language media outlets abroad were suddenly bombarding Iranians with these accusations.
Now, the accusation was that she was picked up because she did not wear the scarf. Was that the original thing?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what, well, that's what they said, but I'm not sure exactly about that, because in Tehran, before she was picked up, some Iranian women would not wear their headscarf. So I don't know exactly what she was wearing, but yes, that's what the Persian media, or not wearing, but that's what they were saying. But the point was that she was beaten to death, that she was tortured to death. And this was the first news that came out. And therefore, that created anger among many people, and people began to go to the streets. Now, I won't say that the protests were huge, but they were significant in number, and they were in multiple cities. The protests, because I have to point something out. So later on, gradually, more information came out. And that was that the footage came out that showed her leaving a police van. She was not handcuffed. She did not show any signs of physical pain. She was not holding her head or anything like that. And she went into a hall, sat there, and then after a while, she got up, spoke to someone, and then suddenly collapsed. So that raised questions about the narrative for many people, at least, not everyone. Many people continue to think that, or believe that she was beaten to death. Then the autopsy took place. Many famous doctors in the country were participants in that autopsy, and they said that she showed no signs of physical pain, and or her body showed no signs of physical damage or trauma. Again, some people continue to question the honesty of the coroner's office, and especially since the coroner's office said that she had an operation when she was 8 years old, a major operation on her brain, which her father refuted. So this raised questions about the autopsy. However, then I think the government felt that it was forced to show some footage of her father admitting the contrary. Out of respect to the father for the first few days, because he lost his daughter, they didn't show anything. But when he constantly made these accusations, then they showed footage of him admitting that she had an operation and that it was a serious operation. And also in the footage, it does show him saying that there are no signs of any physical trauma.
I just want to get into this issue, and then I turn it over to Dr. Hiba. The issue of, I understand exactly that there were a lot of exploitation by Western media and also by the opposition, particularly outside Iran, in trying to push the public into certain directions. That's very understandable, and I think there's a lot of evidence about that. The question here that I'd like to ask you is, even though this information was widely known in Iran, still there were, I wouldn't say it's all over, but there were enough people in the streets that meant that the police had to confront them, or at least deal with them. Now, granted that some of these have been obviously working on behalf of maybe foreign interests, but do you see or do you feel that there are also other reasons for people to be in the streets? And what would these reasons be? Does it have to do with the sanctions? Does it have to do with other things? I would like to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, so these are very valid and important points. I just want to point this out, that gradually these protests died down, but then the riots began to increase. So we had initially there were peaceful protests, ordinary people on the streets. Those protests, you're absolutely correct. They weren't necessarily, according to polls that have been taken, they weren't necessarily just about this young lady. It was also about the general problems that are facing Iranian society: the economy, the sanctions, and the issue of jobs right now for ordinary Iranians. Inflation and jobs have consistently been the two top issues that have been of great concern to ordinary people. So it does combine with these broader issues in society of discontent, of social issues, of economic issues. These combined brought some people to the streets, and some people who didn't go to the streets, they sympathized with the anger and the protests that were, as you pointed out, about much more than just the death of a single person. But the point was that the peaceful protests began to die down after 2, 3, or 4 days. And what began to replace them almost after, I don't remember, I can't give you exact timeline, but very early on were riots. And the riots, so the protests died down for a number of reasons. One was because some of the evidence that was shown began to raise questions in the eyes of people, so some people had less reason to go to the streets, but others still believed that that the government side of the story wasn't convincing enough for them. Another reason was that after a period of time, some people felt that they did their protests and that was enough. But the third issue was that when the riots began, those who were protesting peacefully became marginalized. They didn't want to become part of violence. So that dissuaded many of those people from participating on the streets, because these were no longer protests, they were riots. Now, the riots do not have any sympathy among the bulk of society. The protests did, the riots didn't. And the protests, as you said, since according to polls, people, the discontent that exists in society is not about hijab, and it's not about cultural issues. Those are very minute in society, but it's about inequality, it's about the economy, it's about social injustice, it's about corruption, it's about all these issues. But at the top of the list is, and I don't know which is first and which is second right now, but it's jobs and inflation.
Or I'll get to that in a minute. I just want to turn it over to Dr. Hiba and we involve Dr. Sitara here, and then we get back to you, inshallah. Dr. Hiba? I think you're muted. You might be muted. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. I just want to engage first and thank you for organizing this, Dr. Sami, and for the guests for their time. And I just want to comment regarding the role of media. I'm Egyptian, so we also witnessed during the 70s, 80s, and then in the Arab Spring, different media campaigns against protests, etc. But the question would be basically, how can we verify? And whether in times of lack of protests, when things settle down, whether there would be some type of revisions. So I will leave this question sort of pending in the discussion, and ask more about the situation of women in the Islamic Republic. So Dr. Stara, if you can elaborate on that a bit. How do you see the situation of women, the condition of women between the religious authorities and the long history of women's demands and empowerment in the case of Iran, but also being part of the wider condition that was described, sanctions, the economic situation, social change that is taking place, the needs or demands of the new generations, etc. So how do you see the situation now before we talk about the event that took place before, the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, well, I think with the Islamic Revolution, there were a lot of improvements in the field of women's rights. And This is based on the statistics by the United Nations and various international organizations. For example, the literacy rate, the number of women in jobs, the number of women attending universities. Right now, we have about 57% of our university students are women. And I think that's very significant. And that's why, because of this highly educated female population, we see protests right now happening with having women's rights as a part of it, because it's not the significant part of it, but it is a part of it, and it is reflecting the inequalities that exist in the society, but also how active and dynamic people, and especially women, want to be involved in the society. Right now, we have women active in a lot of different sectors in the government, in society. We have women entrepreneurs, pilots, university professors, doctors, specialists, and I think their presence is really significant. It has improved a lot over the years. We have seen changes in the laws regarding women. Like, we are seeing more, even though I think the progress is happening at a slow rate, but we're seeing more demand and statements made by women to the government, to the parliament, and we have seen changes in the laws because we use the Islamic Sharia law to the Islamic system uses the Sharia law to designate and outline laws for women's rights. And this has been very dynamic. I mean, over the years, it has changed based on different interpretations and adjusting and adapting to the needs of the society. As a woman, I really want to see more equality for women, especially in employment. But I don't, like, having worked in this society, having studied here and taught here, I never felt like a lot of the problems that we had was not significantly like towards women. It was coming from something that affected men and women. For example, unemployment or corruption or inequalities, or how public opinion at some cases were disregarded. For example, with the case of the death of Mahsa Amini, I mean, the government has improved in addressing public opinion, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and that's what I would like to see improved. So I think women are seeing improvement, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that are like, it's the culture that needs to also improve. It's not all, like, everything that happens doesn't have to do with the government. It also comes from educating men and women and families about women's rights, because, you know, a lot of things that happen are not necessarily Islamic. They are part of the culture. And this is something that I hear from a lot of my friends, especially from the Muslim world, but outside Iran, that Iranian women are very outspoken and they're not submissive at all. And that's what you can see in the households and everything. But still, there's a lot of room for improvement. And this is happening slowly. It has taken a momentum, I think. And this is what a part of what we see, like, especially in online campaigns for more equal rights for women. But like, one example that I can give you is, like, I have a friend who, like, someone I know who was part of the protest, and she was really mad at what happened to Mahsa Amini and women's rights and everything. But at home, she was not allowed by her husband to, for example, have social media accounts. So it's like, you can't change something at home, you take it to the streets. And I think that's where it becomes problematic, because if you don't educate men, if you don't educate the society, these protests will die down, and then we go back to what we already had. Nothing significant and fundamental happens within the society. But the new generation is, I think, maybe less patient, but more outspoken. That, for example, my generation, and they're rebelling against their families and the society where they think they are being patriarchal or misogynistic, and I'm happy to see that people are being, like, especially women are being outspoken, but I also think it has to start from the roots, from the families, from the society, from educating men and women about women's rights, and allowing and giving women more space. And then you can make demands to the government, because then if that doesn't happen, then you elect female members of the parliament, but they're not necessarily pro women's rights, right? Because they have that in their mentality that like they're not very demanding in what they have to ask for the government to improve the laws. But in general, I can say that I'm hopeful, because I'm seeing more improvement, more demands made by women. And the parliament and the government have to meet those demands, because, like, so the next time someone wants to campaign or for becoming a member of parliament or the president, they definitely have to take into account that there is half the population, or there are women who are asking for more, and they're definitely going to, I mean, if they want to have more chances to win, they're probably going to take that into account and think about how they can attract more women to vote for them.
Dr. Sadiqi, if I may, after over 4 decades of the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution, if I'd like to ask you, what would be the 3 more positive things that you see or you could point to for the accomplishment of the Islamic Republic? And what would be the 3 things that you would like to see more improved, that they haven't happened or didn't happen either fast enough or big enough after 4 decades?
That's like in general, not necessarily women.
Oh yeah.
Well, I think the first and the most important accomplishment by the Islamic Revolution was independence. An independent Iran that doesn't bow down to any major power, no matter what level of pressure is imposed on it. And I think that's really amazing. It's something that you don't really see anywhere in the world. That's number one. And the second thing is, I think, a larger participation of the public in the decision-making system. We have different governmental bodies that are either directly or indirectly elected by the people, and that shows a larger participation by the Iranian nation in the decision-making. And
Can you elaborate on this? What do you mean more participation? Are you talking about election?
Yes, elections. Like, we had a monarchy with like a Shah that was not elected and sat, and then there could be coups like the one that we had in 1953 by the United States, and easily just replacing a prime minister who was elected by people with someone else, and public opinion and popular vote was totally disregarded. But this is not the case now. We have different governmental bodies that even the supreme leader is in some way elected indirectly by popular vote. And so I think that's significant. Like, we elect parliament members, we elect members of the council, city councils, we elect members of the expedience council, and there are different, not the expediency council, sorry, okay. The council of the experts.
The council of experts, and I understand. Okay, what's the third thing?
Yes. And the third thing, because this is something that I haven't, listed from before. So the first thing that comes to my mind is, I think the progress that we have had in science and technology, because we stand top in a lot of like among the best countries in the world in different fields of sciences, and we produce a lot of things on ourselves, which is also part of our independence. And thanks to sanctions, which have hurt ordinary Iranians in many ways, but it has also made us rely on our own capabilities, because the sanctions have been intensified over the past few years, but we have been under sanctions for 40 years, for plus 40 years. And this is something that we have learned how to develop our capabilities within the country so that we don't have to rely on outside.
And the three that you think have not been accomplished, and you think that they should have?
Well, I think I would say there are three. I would address on the three things that I think we need to improve. They're not necessarily something that we haven't accomplished, but for me, it's again, it's that I want to see even more participation of people in the decision making, and I would like to see that the government adapts to the demands that people seek in that regard, and it's also more women's rights. I mean, it's definitely a lot better than what we had before the revolution, but it's also definitely something that there is a lot of room for improvement, and that's something that I want to see, especially by educating the nation and the grassroots, and then because I think that's the first and the most important step. And the third thing is, which I think it's also a prelude to the two other thing, is economy. Our economy is suffering. A part of it is due to the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran, the unilateral coercive measures by the United States and sanctions by the UN. But it's also because of mismanagement and corruption that exists in the country.
Very well, Dr. Huda.
Yes, I wanted to I wanted to pick on Dr. Bitara and also Dr. Mandani and Dr. Marandi, I'm sorry, and wanted to ask about the public sphere. I know that the indicators and the sort of institutional and organizational indicators are good, and the participation of women, the empowerment, decision making, different organizations, etc. But I also think that maybe I would like to hear more about the transformation in the public sphere, and whether this citizenry, the civicness of the public sphere, is developing in new ways, specifically to accommodate the demands of the youth, as you mentioned, Dr. Taro, and you mentioned they are not patient enough. The demands, they want to see the change occurring here and now. But what about the public sphere? To which extent did the political foreign policies against Iran and the political situation in Iran affect this accessibility of the public sphere in a way that is much more towards spontaneity rather than being structured and organized, etc.? Because I think this is very important. So I addressed my question basically to both professors.
Yeah, Professor Marandi, do you want to start?
Dr. Marandi? Maybe he's coming back. Why didn't you start? Oh, here he is. Okay, Dr. Marandi, you heard the question, right?
Yes. Well, that's a difficult question to ask. I should have done some reading beforehand so I could give you a more adequate response. And maybe I should have consulted a couple of colleagues from social sciences. Let me begin by saying that there are a couple of elements that I think also had a huge impact on the youth, and that is the fact that schools and universities were shut for 2 years, or more than 2 years, a bit more than 2 years. And in the protests, in the riots, again, because the
You
protests
mean because of the pandemic? Is that
Yeah.
what?
yes, because of the pandemic, because of the coronavirus and so on. The schools were based, everything was online. My university classes were online. I've had university students who I just met for the first time a few months ago, because all of my interaction with them had been through the internet. So when the University of Tehran reopened, meaning reopened for public attendance, for students to attend class on campus, we did, professors, colleagues, did notice that there was a significant change in the students. They were less knowledgeable. Obviously, a lot of them had been cheating on exams because they weren't nearly as well informed as, let's say, before the students of their age or of their in that class before the pandemic. They were, and I don't want to generalize, but we did notice that there was a lot less patience with professors, a lot more aggressiveness among students, relatively speaking, than before. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of the pandemic, but that is something that that didn't go unnoticed. So that may have contributed to some of the impatience and the anger and the really abusive language that was not only used towards government officials, but towards professors. Students who attended class were attacked or sometimes threatened by these hardcore rioters or professors. We had a faculty meeting, and one of my female colleagues, she said that she was, how should I put it, threatened. The threats were of a sexual nature. The dean of my faculty is a woman, ironically. She experienced a lot of abuse from some of these students. So there's, that group, because most of the rioters were actually between the age of 17, 16 to 22, 23.
Did they have any demands or just violence for the sake of violence?
No, I think it differs, because there was no single cause. There were those who wanted to overthrow the Islamic Republic. There are those who were just venting outrage. A lot of the demands were actually, and again, since it's localized, you cannot, on campus or different campuses, they were different, and on the streets, they were perhaps different. They were definitely different, but some of them were as silly as they wanted to have the university lunch halls, the girls and boys sitting together. That was something that was a demand of some of the students. So it went all the way from overthrowing the Islamic Republic to having girls and boys eat lunch together in the lunch in the university restaurants. So it's very difficult to say, but what I would like to focus on is the issue that Iran is, as I don't want to go into the issue of women's rights or anything like that, because I would rather a woman do that. But the way in which Iran is presented outside of the country, in the broader world, is as if Iran was somehow like the Taliban, the religious authorities, for example. What do the religious authorities say? Whereas if you watch the news in Iran and they speak about the government, the administration, only the president and maybe one or two other people are religious figures. Everyone else they're just engineers and physicians and social scientists and just or people who have university expertise. if you go to parliament, the overwhelming majority of the MPs are, again,
Lay people.
social scientists, physicians, engineers, and so on. And maybe there are a handful of religious figures in parliament as well. The Speaker of Parliament is a war veteran and a professor at the University of Tehran. So this sort of understanding of how Iran functions is very different from the reality on the ground. There's this sort of this caricature of Iran that dominates. I could give a very anecdotal example. A colleague that I brought to Iran, we invited to Iran once, someone who you know of at least. I won't give you his name, but you've either met him or you know of him. He was very surprised, and this was like 15 years ago. 10 years ago maybe. He was very surprised to see women driving, and I let him remain surprised. But I noticed his surprise. And then he said, I didn't know women drove here. I said, we have women pilots. We have women helicopter pilots, so taxi drivers, truck drivers. There's nothing strange about this. But the point is that based upon, and even though he was a pretty open-minded person, he's not the ordinary, Western academic coming to Iran where they have bags of tin food and crisp and all that to survive hunger, and we've experienced that too. But his understanding was deeply impacted by the dominant Western narratives. And the irony, of course, is that this also exists among ordinary Iranians about their own society. So when Western narratives about Iran are repeated constantly, it does create a sense among at least some in Iran that there's something wrong with us. I'm not saying that Iran is not is a utopia or there's nothing wrong with Iran. Iran is an ordinary society, like any other society. All the good things that you see in Iran, you'll see in other countries. The bad things you'll see in other countries. They're good things, but I must point out that Iran, if you take into account the sanctions and the constant media warfare, Iran is a quite open society, and that's saying a lot when you're constantly being undermined. When the rioters, many of the rioters are funded from abroad. I mean, these groups say it openly. The MEK, the monarchists, the Komole in the Iraqi Kurdistan, and other groups in Sistan and Baluchistan. All of these are funded by foreign governments, and all of them claim to be involved in the riots across the country and in terrorist attacks and assassinations. So it's not something that the Iranian government is claiming. And then you have this huge media apparatus. So despite all that, the fact that Iran is so open, I think, is an achievement. It's not ideal. Iran is not a utopia. The situation for women in Iran is not ideal. The situation for men in Iran is not ideal. But the point is that it is not that utopia that they see in the West. In the United States, for example, and I gave this example, I think, on CNN.
Let me pick on a point that you mentioned, that you said we're not like Afghanistan, or we're not like there is no sort of these images are just stereotypes. It might sound a bit like a very weird question, but I want to ask, considering zooming out, considering the whole regional situation and what you mentioned, like mirroring positions and assuming things, etc. Do you think that what is going on in the public sphere again, because this is my concern, and the civic sphere, what is going on in Saudi Arabia has an impact on the situation in Iran?
Before you answer, I just want to say we're midway, so I'm going to give a few minutes to Dr. Marandi and Dr. Sadiqi, so we can switch to foreign affairs.
Okay. No, I don't think Saudi Arabia Saudi society has an impact on...
I mean, the images that are spread for the youth in Iran, like what is going on in the opening of the public sphere, etc. So would that have an impact of raising the expectations and ceiling of demand?
Not really. I can't say. I don't think, no. I think that those youth in Iran who are Western oriented, who are liberal, who see the United States as the land of freedom and hope and where you can become rich and all that, and that does exist among many of these young people who during the last couple of years have been spending a lot of time listening to music and watching movies. I mean, there's no exaggeration, is that they have not been. Uh, I mean, it has a significant impact. I think that these people look to the West. They don't look to Saudi, Saudi Arabia, or they don't look to Russia, or they don't look to China, or they don't look to India or anywhere else. They look at largely the United States. They think that that is where things happen, and that is how we want to be a part of that. That's from my understanding. So it is Western influence, but I think at the it's the United States that stands at the top of the West. So, and I'm not saying that this is, and again, I should be very careful that I'm not talking about the majority of the youth. I'm not talking about a particular age group that I'm claiming it behaves as such, but it is a significant subgroup, at least, or a significant part of, I think, those between 22, 23, or 16, 17 to 22 and 23. Now, whether it will remain like this, whether it will, because Iran is a very dynamic society. But I would like to just give two quick examples and then end for now. One is that in August 2011, in the UK, there were riots, especially in London. And it was because the police had shot and killed a young man. And a number of people died during the riots. I don't know the exact number, 5 or 6, probably. And your viewers can look it up. But what happened was that the prime minister at the time, the conservative prime minister, he was thinking about shutting down Facebook, Twitter, and BlackBerry. Back then, BlackBerry was a thing. It was more important than now. I don't even know if it exists anymore, but in any case, he didn't ultimately do it because Twitter, Facebook, and BlackBerry, they cooperated with the government. And so those people who used the internet to guide the riots, to bring people to the streets, to encourage people to go to the streets, or to tell people to go to a designated place, were arrested by the British government. In fact, 2 young men served 4 years in jail because they told people to gather somewhere, and no one actually did. According to their lawyers, they proved that no one responded to their calls, but they still went to jail for 4 years. In Iran, it's the exact opposite. Big tech helps the rioters. It muffles the voice of those who are opposed to the riots. And of course, the Western media says nothing about the huge anti-riot protests that we saw in Tehran. The anti-riot protests that we've seen across the country and the protests against the violence, they were much, much larger than any of the protests or any of the riots that we saw during the early days or during the last few weeks. But you won't see that in the Western media. So these, in the case of Iran, Western media, or Persian language Western media, and those troll farms encourage people to make Molotov cocktails. They teach them how to use weapons against the police. The Iran International, the Saudi outlet in London, actually tells people that if they burn police, if they kill police, if they strangle police, it's justified. Now, those who live in England, or those who've been to England, know that in England, that's illegal. Ofcom would, if these were in English, or if they were directed towards an English audience, an English-speaking audience, not even in the UK, Ofcom would shut them down immediately, and they'd go to court. But in the case of Iran, day and night, they're encouraging violence, and different media outlets and accounts. I've had probably over 100 death threats and not just directed towards myself, but towards my family members. And they would explain how they would kill family members. I don't want to go into detail, but the complaints, none of them had any impact, nothing. So they were very explicit, very straightforward, but none of those accounts were shut down, even though complaints were sent, not just by me, but others. So the point is that big tech is siding with these people. The Persian language media funded by Western governments is siding with, rioters, with violence. But when it happens in the United States or the UK, countries that are not, well, the example I gave was the UK, was that not only is the country not sanctioned, it functions normally, but big tech cooperates with the government. So when you take this into account, I would say actually that there's a lot going for Iran, and just like in Venezuela. That's one reason why I think that when Western countries say, "Oh, the government in Venezuela cannot self-govern, they cannot govern the country adequately." Well, they strangled the country, and then they say, "Well, why can't you breathe?" If they remove the sanctions and allow Venezuela and Cuba to function normally, then perhaps they would probably be doing much better than many U.S. allies, or maybe many of the Western governments.
You are moving already to the international relations, so let's go back to Dr.
So I'll leave it there.
Let's go back to Dr. Sadiki and ask her to elaborate on the issue.
Yeah, I think with your question regarding the public sphere and how this happened, I also think that the pandemic and the lockdown, even though Iran did not really have crazy lockdowns as we witness in some European countries or in America, they had a huge impact on the psychological well-being of families and children. Like, a lot of children were deprived of having peers to simply socialize with, and this had significant consequences. And it's also that Iran is experiencing a decline in fertility rate and population, and a lot of families have only one kid. A lot of these kids barely have like cousins even to socialize with. So their only chance and opportunity to socialize with their peers, to experience excitement and hang out with their friends, were taken away from them, which I think that's something that we're going to see in the long run. It's just the beginning of the effects that it has had. We are going to see a lot more of the impact that it had on people. But it's also the demographics, the changing demographics, the demographics of Iran, and how, as I said, like, families are changing from larger families to smaller families. Children who grow up in families where they're the only child and they take probably all the attention. We're also seeing a growing divorce rate and families, like, because the Iranian society is very family oriented, and the safety and security that people feel is largely because of families still functioning. And I think that helps a lot with how women feel safe and the society feels safe. But we're seeing a trend that can be very dangerous, I think. And a lot of these teenagers who took part in the protests have seen not only the economic pressure, but also some maybe family issues or problems within the families that my generation, for example, did not experience as such. And I think that also has to be, if the government wants to make decisions and plan for future to meet the public opinion, and to see what the demands of this new generation, as like the Generation Z, as they call in the US, wants, they have to take into account these problems too. That's I think that has a very significant effect on the society in general.
I'm very
Dr.
happy you mentioned
Sadiqi,
the social aspect and also Dr. Marandi, because we usually focus on the political. It's very Iran is very political. Everything that is related to Iran is politicized. So it's good also
Yeah, that's true.
to look at the social aspects. Dr. Sami?
thank you. Dr. Sadiqi, we have a lot to cover, so I would appreciate from both you and Dr. Marandi short answers as you fit,
Sure.
you see fit. You mentioned that some of the things that Iranians are proud of, the fact that you feel more expressing your will and independence throughout the world. As you see, as your observer, as a political scientist, as someone who studied Iranian foreign policy, who makes Iranian foreign policy?
Was that a question for me?
Yeah, for both of you actually, but we'll
Okay.
start with you, and then I'm gonna ask Dr. Marandi also something that would be associated with this question.
Well, I think that's there are different parts from the society and the government that make the foreign policy. For example, you see when because like the Iranian society is very aware of politics, because every political decision comes with an economic consequence. For example, when people decided to vote for President Rouhani, because he was in his election campaigns, he was talking about negotiating with the P5+1 to reach a nuclear deal. He was promising that would ease the sanctions and bring about economic ease for the country. So people decided to vote for him. So it comes from the bottom up, and then you have different sectors who like the parliament and the president who make decide about what foreign policy to take. But I think it starts and it comes from the people, but it's also it's designed and planned and implemented by different governmental bodies.
What is the role of the supreme leader?
Well, the supreme leader is like he can have the final say, but he usually just advises. For example, in the case of exactly JCPOA, you see that different governments took very different stances towards the JCPOA, and the supreme leader was always very supportive of whatever decision was made by the administration, because they were elected by the people, and that's what matters. And he doesn't even allow disrespecting or calling. For example, in one speech, he warned people not to call the negotiating team as traitors, because some conservatives in Iran were saying that negotiating with the US or major powers was contradictory to our revolutionary values. But he made it clear that that was not the case, and this is something that the administration is working on and deciding for the interest and benefit of the people and the nation, even though if that decision is not necessarily bringing the goals that they were meant to bring because of how those signatories acted.
Right. Dr. Marandi, if I may, what, in your opinion, is the most important strategic imperatives of Iran? Because some people, particularly in the Arab world, they believe that Iran has a project, and that project is centered around maybe restoring the Persian Empire. Others say dominating the area in sectarian ways. And others, of course, refute that, and they give different examples. So if you were asked that question by a man in the street walking in any Arab capital, and they ask you the question, what drives Iranian foreign policy? And then we can go to specifics after that, particularly if we have time, address this saying that is repeated in many official media in different Arab capitals, that Iran occupies 4 Arab capitals, and that's what is being stated repeatedly. So, but before we get to these examples, can you point out what would be the most important imperatives driving Iranian foreign policy in the era of the Islamic Republic? And then we'll go also to Dr. Hiba and Dr. Sadiq.
It's interesting that the opponents of the Islamic Republic of Iran, in Iran, many of these rioters, many of those who advocate the rioting, and the Persian language media in the West, they attack Iran for supporting the Palestinians and spending so much money on Arabs, as they say. And many of them are very, actually quite, well, I don't want to say everyone, but many of these people, if you watch BBC Persian or Iran International, which is a Saudi outlet, these people are anti-Arab, they're anti-Islamic, and their opposition to Iranian foreign policy has a lot to do with the fact that they say the mullahs, as they like to say, that they're Arabs. So it's interesting how these two narratives coexist, both hostile towards Iran, but in competing narratives in two different languages, of course, but completely the opposite from one another. I would say that Iran's two key foreign policy objectives is one, ending the US presence in West Asia and bringing an end to the apartheid regime in Palestine. Those are the two key foreign policy objectives of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Iran has paid a heavy price and for their support for the Palestinian cause. And I think it's quite obvious that if it wasn't for these policies, these sanctions and this antagonism wouldn't exist, and not nearly as much as they do. And that is actually the reason why many of these people are so hostile, and they say no to Palestine and no to Lebanon, because they see, because they don't want to be a part of that. But, and here I would have to sort of open a parenthesis and sort of give my own personal answer. And that is that I would say that here actually idealism and realism are not contradictory. These ideals do come at a price, I would argue, but not pursuing those ideals would also come at a major price. And it is not as if the United States and its allies would just simply allow the Israeli regime to continue with its occupation of Palestinian territories, and I mean the whole of Palestine, and let the rest of the region to exist without any difficulty. The United States would make sure that the countries in the region are weak and divided in order for the Israeli regime to thrive. And that would include countries like the Islamic Republic of Iran. It would include countries like Egypt and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and any other country in this region. But that is a sort of parenthesis or a footnote maybe. But yes, I think that these two issues for Iran are key, and I think Iran will continue to pursue both of them until, at least that is the belief in Iran, that until they are able to make sure both happen. And an important point that I should make is that one reason why the Iranians have been more tilted towards Russia in this war is, first of all, the Iranians believe that the Americans, they expanded eastwards.
You're talking about the Ukrainian.
Yes, because this falls within this context.
Mm-hmm.
So Iran's policy is to drive the US out of the region. The United States is expanding NATO eastwards.
Right.
And they did it. They carried out a coup in Ukraine. They helped right-wing fascists, just like they did in supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and we can leave that for a different discussion, just like they did with the Contra rebels in Latin America, just like they did it's well documented that how the United States and its allies have supported the extremists, so I don't want to go there. But the NATO advancing eastwards is a threat to Iran. And if NATO, if Ukraine, under these circumstances and with this geography, if it became a part of NATO, then Western countries would continue to expand towards Georgia and the Caucasus.
Mm.
And Iran sees NATO as a threat to the region. So the reason why Iran supports Russia is A, because Iran believes that the Western countries are more guilty than the Russians for provoking this war and for killing so many Russian Ukrainians, but also because this is NATO that is advancing eastwards. And so it falls within that context that I was trying to explain earlier about Iran's the intention of Iran to weaken NATO and to expel the US from West Asia. So the weakening of NATO in Europe contributes to the general weakening of the United States.
Very well. Thank you very much. Again, we have about 15 minutes left and about 3 or 4 questions, so I appreciate short answers. Dr. Hiba.
It's very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Sami. It's interesting that when you were talking about the expansion, I can mirror to you that there is the same impression in the Arab world that Iran is expanding in Iraq, that Iran is expanding via its influence on the Syrian regime, that Iran is expanding and try to actually expand its influence in different countries, including Sudan and other countries. So it's very interesting that I think there is a need for a dialogue, really, because how Iran is perceived in the Arab world, it's not only because of the hostility between the regimes, but also the public opinion has its own concerns regarding the role of Iran in Iraq and Syria. And these are two major countries in the Arab world that have been affected very much by the Iranian intervention, let alone Lebanon, of course. So, so do you think that there can be, I mean, we had Sunni Shia dialogues, which actually faced a lot of crisis because of the political situation in the last 10 years in Iraq and then in Syria. So do you think that there is a horizon for dialogues between different countries in the region, and an Arab-Iranian dialogue can take place? There were some attempts maybe 10 or 15 years ago in Egypt, hosted, as far as I remember, by the Al-Ahram Strategic Center at the time, maybe a couple of rounds or so. But do you think this can take place in the near future, an attempt to sort of start a dialogue and discuss the pending issues, even between civil society activists and maybe between different civil society groups? And do you think, Dr. Sadiki, that this can take place?
Is this directed towards me?
To both of you, actually. I mean, briefly. And you do think that?
Yeah, I definitely think that's possible. In fact, I think that Iran's policy in Syria and in Lebanon and in Iraq is largely influenced by what Iran sees as U.S. intervention. I constantly travel to countries like Turkey, and in 2011 and 12, I participated in the Istanbul Forum, which back then was held every year. I think it ceased to exist after a few years, but back then I was saying to friends that the United States is supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria, and my Turkish friends were very skeptical of what I was saying, and they saw it very differently. But later on, we saw that when WikiLeaks came out, and here I should remind us all of the fact that Julian Assange continues to be in solitary confinement in London, and he is the world's most famous political prisoner. I just should pay a small tribute to him and his work. WikiLeaks documents exposed later on that on February the 12th, 2012, Jake Sullivan, who is the current U.S. National Security Advisor to the U.S. President, he sent an email to Hillary Clinton, who was back then the Secretary of State, admitting or saying that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. And of course, ISIS came out from Al-Qaeda. And we know also from the 2012 National Defense Intelligence Agency document of the United States about creating a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq and all that. So the Iranian position on the region, and also ISIS expansion and the US occupation of Iraq and the US occupation of Afghanistan and the US presence in the Persian Gulf region, and how the United States undermined the revolution in Egypt, and the list goes on. Iran sees its antagonists in this region as the United States and Israel. And wherever the United States stands in this region, I think by default, Iran will stand on the other side. The Iranians may try to use or use the Americans, like when the Americans invaded Iraq. The Iranians, they opposed the war, but they tried to undermine the U.S. occupation. But in Afghanistan, because the United States was fighting against the Taliban, who back then killed Iranians, and Al-Qaeda, which was a threat to Iran, the Iranians welcomed it, but they didn't. They were happy to see it, but they wanted the Americans to leave immediately. So I would say that in Afghanistan, there was an exception where the Iranians initially did cooperate with the United States, and many could say that wasn't a good idea. But in general, I would say that the Iranians, wherever the Americans stand, the Iranians would probably tend to stand on the other side of the equation.
I also think that if the Iranian nation and the nations in the region understand that the U.S. and Israel are the shared enemy that we have, it's actually not very difficult to unite against those adversaries. And I think the issue of Palestine, because Iran has been very steadfast in supporting Palestine and has paid a heavy price for it. But we as Iranians have always been very proud of that. And I think that's something that we can get the nations of the region to unite around it. And one major obstacle, I think, is that the US is playing a major role in shaping the public opinion inside the region of other nations in the region. For example, there are probably a lot of Iranians who get their idea of the people in Saudi Arabia or in Iraq or in Egypt or in Jordan or other countries from US media. And this is also true for those nations and their ideas of Iran. So if we understand that who is shaping that public opinion, and then it becomes easy to realize that this is not the reality. This is something, this is a perception that is being imposed on the nations because the US wants to forward its expansionist goals in the region. And I also think that, another obstacle is the attempts at the normalization of relations with the Israeli regime, which I'm sure the majority of the people in those nations are against it, but the governments are doing it. And this is something also that, the Iranian government has never done and has always opposed. And if more people in other nations realize how Iran has been supporting the interest of the region, it becomes easier to cooperate. And the other thing is, for example, I think there is need for more grassroots connection between the people, without any intermediates, any connection between the people of Iran and other nations in the region can facilitate unifying around the same cause. For example, people like Egyptians can easily travel to Iran, but Iranians can never travel to Egypt or to Jordan. It's almost impossible. And this makes it very difficult to have direct contacts with those nations and to bring about an understanding and how we share a lot of things. Like the Islamic identity among Iranians is very strong, and this is something that we share. We take pride in being, for example, the descendants of the Prophet and being believers in Islam. So there are so many things that we can unite around. And if we try to get our idea of other nations in the region directly from them rather than US media or propaganda, it becomes a lot easier, I think.
Very well. I'm going to ask you a question, Dr. Sadiqi. I want to think about it while I'm asking Dr. Marandi a different question. The question I would like to ask you is, what do you think the major misconception that Iranians have about this region, in other words, the Arab world, and what do you think the major misconception you think about Iran outside Iran, particularly in this? In other words, what do you think the people of Iran have the major misconception about and what do you think the outside have the major misconception about Iran? Meanwhile, I'll be remiss if I don't ask you, Dr. Marandi, about the nuclear negotiations. Where do you think we're heading? And what would be the reasons that we haven't seen conclusions so far?
I'd like to add to what was said earlier by Dr. Sadiqi, that it's not only the Western media, but in our region, the media owned by Saudi Arabia, among others, they have a major impact in the way in which people view Iran. So Iran and its supporters don't have much of a voice outside its borders. And also, even in Europe and the United States, because of the sanctions, disproportionately, many Iranians tried to migrate to the West. And in order for Iranians to gain status, to be able to get a permanent visa, they have to be opposed, or at least appear to be opposed to Iran. So sometimes people say, well, why are so many Iranians in the West opposed to the Islamic Republic? Well, it's basically because those who aren't opposed are not going to become political, because it comes at a cost. You cannot support Iran, just like today, I'm sure you cannot support Russia in Europe. And I don't want to compare Iran and Russia, but I'm just giving it as an example. You cannot get a decent job and be an open supporter of Russia in Western countries. So those Iranians who come and go, and many come and go to Iran, they are mute. They don't say much. And those who are very hostile, you have literally, if I go back to the examples I gave, all the media outlets, all the troll farms, there are maybe 20, 30,000 Iranians involved in North America and Europe in this anti-Iranian industry at some level. So so there is a motive for some people to think that way. But it's difficult for me to say how, what is there about Iranians abroad, how they think about the region, or what their views might be that may be inconsistent with reality, because I haven't seen, or I can't think of anything in particular, because it's a huge country and I have to look at polls and to see how anything that I think would be anecdotal. What I can say is that the Iranians are more informed about themselves from abroad than they are from home. And what does that mean? It means that there's more, if you go online and you include the bots and trolls and you include all the Persian language media from abroad, the amount of news that is produced about Iran from the outside is significantly more than what is produced inside or allowed to be produced, because, as I said, Iranian media is silenced, Iranian websites are taken offline. I've lost my accounts except for my Twitter account. So the Iranian, or the different Iranian sides of the story from inside the country, working at a disadvantage. So the Iranians are much, for example, Europeans and Americans, I would say, are very ignorant about Iran. But Iran gets a lot of its information from Europe and the United States. So I don't think you can say that the Iranians are equally ignorant about the West. In fact, I would argue that the news that the Iranians receive about Europe and the United States is much more uplifting than and more positive than the reality on the ground in Europe and the United States. But going to the nuclear talks, and again, I must stress that I don't currently, I'm not currently associated with the nuclear talks at any level. I only was a part of the delegation in 2015 and earlier on this year in Vienna. So whenever the delegations were in Vienna, I was a part of the delegations but in Tehran, I'm just a teacher at the University of Tehran. But what I can say is that Iran never left the nuclear deal. And Iran, the United States under Obama, they violated the deal. Under Trump, they tore up the deal. Under Biden, they continue to pursue Trump's policies of maximum pressure, which basically leaves the US without any leverage, as I may have alluded to earlier. The Iranians, they look at 2015 and they saw how the United States used loopholes in the deal to cheat Iran under Obama. And then, as I said, Trump left the deal. So now the Iranians have been, during the last year, during the negotiations, the Iranians were trying to negotiate a deal where the United States could no longer use loopholes. So they used the experience that we gained during the last 3 US administrations, and a lot has been resolved. Most of the issues have been resolved during these long months of tough negotiations, both direct negotiations between Iran and the P4+1, where the Americans were sort of sitting in a hotel nearby, and then messages would go back and forth, and also when the delegations were back in their capitals. The messages would go back and forth. So where are we now? During the last day of the talks in Vienna, the Europeans gave a text. And that text met many of Iran's key demands that it had been able, it was able to gain those concessions during months of negotiations. So the Iranians took the text home. They said certain changes needed to be made. They sent it back to the EU, and Joseph Borrell said that the Iranian demands are reasonable.
Joseph Borrell is the chief
US, EU foreign policy chief, and yes. So at that time, it was believed in Tehran that we have a deal, basically, because Borrell is a U.S. ally. He's no friend of Iran. When he says the Iranian demands are reasonable, then that means it's finished. But the United States delayed their response, and after they responded, they didn't give an adequate response. And from then on, it became clear to Iran that the U.S. elections were a key concern, and probably the elections in the Israeli regime were more concern. So since then, things have slowed down, and in some cases halted, although messages contrary to what the U.S. chief negotiator or representative says. The U.S. has been sending messages to Iran. We have to see what happens after the U.S. election. We'll have to see what happens after the U.S. election. The differences right now are just a few words, literally, but they are important words. The Americans want to keep those words open and vague. The Iranians want them to be precise. Why? Because the Americans want to keep them vague, because in law, if they're vague, then they can take advantage of that. The Iranians don't want any more loopholes. We've experienced these things before, and we know that if we give...
What do these words involve? Do they involve sanctions, or do they involve some commitments from Europeans and Americans? Or what exactly do they involve? Do we know?
I can't go into detail about the negotiations, but the areas in which the Iranians have made major gains were with regards to guarantees that the Americans would not repeat what they did in the past. Also sequencing. So for example, in 2015, the Iranians carried out all of their commitments and then waited for the Americans, which never happened. And so this time around, the Americans would have to make the first steps, and then the Iranians would reciprocate, and the Americans would have to take another step, and so on. And there's also the issue.
Do you think Netanyahu becoming the next, probably, prime minister of the Zionist entity would make a difference?
Personally, I think that Netanyahu being the prime minister is the worst case scenario for the Israeli regime and for its Western allies, because the facade is gone. The lies of a two-state solution, the lies of finding some sort of means for the Palestinian people to live with dignity, all these Western lies, and they've been lying, and they know that they've been lying, and they know that they are lying. These lies are all gone. So for me, I think Netanyahu is actually a good thing for the Palestinian cause and for the growing awareness, even in the West. Despite
the Zionist right being in charge of the Zionist state is a good thing for the world. All right, Dr. Sadiqi, before I turn it to Dr. Hiba for the last question.
Yeah, so for your question as what is the misconception that Iranians have about the nations in the region and the other way around? Well, I think it's difficult to say because there haven't been many opinion polls with regards to that. And that's something that is, I think, necessary to do. But one thing that I personally feel is important to address, but it's not necessarily like the biggest misconception that Iranians have about other nations or other nations have about Iran, but that's how, I mean, we're the Shia Sunni like manufactured division, because it does not really exist. I mean, we share so many things, and it's in Iran, people do not really care about whether it's Shia or Sunni. Like, you don't ask people. I have had Sunni friends, and it never was an issue, really. And I think this is also something that is imposed in the region from outside, because like, you know, it's always easy to divide and conquer. And that's what the goal and the objective of foreign intervention inside the region. And it's, I mean, it's also something which is probably not very difficult to achieve, even though it has been there. I mean, the attempts to create division between Shia and Sunni by the British government initially has been there for many decades. But there are also many factors that can help undo it and reverse the trend. For example, that's all the nations in the region have been victims in one way or another, have been victims of terrorism by ISIS, or the fact that all the nations in the region, regardless of, for example, being Shia or Sunni, support the Palestinian cause, should make it easy to remove those misconceptions that exist between the nations.
Dr. Hiba?
I wanted to pull it back to domestic politics. So my last question would be basically the impact of the urban factor. We focus on politics, we focus in economics and international relations, etc. But what about the transformation that has been going on due to the changes in the urban configurations in Iran? What are the changes that place? We have a rising urban construction projects. I mean, expanding the spaces of the urban texture in different Arab countries. And I was very curious about the situation in Iran, maybe because this can also lead to a change in the demonstrations and the rights map. So how does the urban space and the urban trajectories and configuration look like now, and the changes that are going on?
Was that a question for me or Professor Mirandi?
Both of you, briefly.
Okay. Well, this is something that I really do not have enough information to comment on. This is something that I haven't thought about it, to be honest.
Because
I don't think I can
that
make a comment.
women's participation in the public sphere is also very much related to spaces. How far the spaces allow them to be able to interact and be present in the public sphere and organize activities, etc. Not only women, but generally even youth and social movements, etc. So this, I mean, in the Gezi Park, in the case of Turkey, for example, it was an urban issue that raised the concerns. In Egypt, we have a new capital. It's being built in Egypt, and there are concerns regarding social equality, etc., related to that expansion of the urban space, and also how it will affect the different repertoires of protests, etc. So I just wanted to bring in the urban factor. Maybe if yeah, and you can quickly think about it.
Perhaps Dr. Mirandi can participate in this question.
Yes.
Okay, I'll be very cautious because I'm not a social scientist, and I don't want colleagues to think that I'm interfering in an area which I don't have much expertise. I would just give a few thoughts which may not be very well organized. One is that I think today the issue is not so much the urban space, but it's the cybersphere that is the real change that we are seeing, at least over the last 10, 15 years. Tehran has always been a huge city, like Istanbul and like other major cities. And but right now, I think what we've been seeing over the last few weeks in Iran have a lot more to do with the internet and so on. But I think actually the urban space is more important. And I'm not saying more important than the internet, but what I'm saying is that it's more important in the sense that any unhappiness that exists in Iran, according to polls. And by the way, when I say unhappiness, that does not mean that that means the Islamic Republic is illegitimate in the eyes of the public. No, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a high degree of legitimacy in all the polls that have been taken by the different institutions, both locally and international. And you know, the martyrdom of General Soleimani and the funerals, I think, attest to that as well. This was less than 3 years ago. But the unhappiness that exists in Iran, I think, stems mostly, in my opinion, as I said, because of jobs and inflation. But I think behind a lot of that is the issue of social injustice. And this, I think, is very key. Because if, and again, I'm not a social scientist, but if there's greater social justice, accepting hardship or difficulty is much easier for public. And one of the things that happened in Iran post-revolution was that Iran moved towards social justice. And for the first decade, that was a central theme. So a lot was done for universal education, for universal health care. For the majority of school children, the majority of Iranians didn't go to school. It became universal education literally within a few years. Healthcare, you had a huge health care network developed across the country, especially in deprived areas and in the suburbs, the poor suburbs of major cities. And that contributed a lot to the public support for different administrations. And here I'm what I'm going to say may be controversial, and maybe people won't agree, but I would argue that when Mr. Rafsanjani became president, during that period, it roughly coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
That would have been 1989.
Yes, that's right. And it coincided with the decline and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also the war in Iraq. Now, the war in Iraq was a very strange war, the Kuwait, the occupation of Kuwait, because the United States humiliated Saddam Hussein. And although your younger viewers don't remember this, Saddam Hussein allowed his army to be bombed for 40 days without doing anything, without even fighting back. And that is a mystery for me why that happened. I'm not saying there was collusion or anything, but it's still extraordinary. But the American victory in Kuwait was overwhelming. And it sort of, the ghost of Vietnam was gone. And the Americans, America was great once again. And at the same time, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the left was hit very hard. And in Iran, the left, and I mean the Islamic left, those who sort of believed in social justice, and many of them were extreme. Many of these reformists today were the hardcore revolutionary supporters. They were very hardcore socialists. They were very strict. And then they sort of flipped, just sort of like, well, they flipped. They became very liberal. So Iran moved towards liberal economics. And I personally have no problem with the private sector, but I'm as you can probably tell, I'm a critic of liberal economics and neoliberalism. So Iran moved in that direction, and under Mr. Rafsanjani and Mr. Khatami, the gap between rich and poor grew, and I think that hurt Iran significantly. It had its advantages, but it had its major disadvantages. When Ahmadinejad became candidate, no one knew him, but he understood what was happening in society and
he was the mayor of Tehran at the time, right?
He was the mayor of Tehran, but he was still an unknown, relatively speaking, in Iran. But he won the election and was reelected because most people saw him as a person who was pursuing social justice. Now, I would say that his methods were very flawed, but that's how he was seen. And the reason why in 2009 there were riots, and especially among the liberals and the more wealthy, and I'm not saying all liberals are secular or pro-Western, but in general, those who were more liberal, they believed that there was fraud. It was because they really couldn't understand how he could have won. But it was quite obvious. If you went to the south of Tehran or to the suburbs or to the villages, people voted for him because they wanted a fair share of the cake. Rouhani, when he came to power, in my opinion, he mistakenly thought that the mood among ordinary Iranians had shifted, and this is again my interpretation, and it may be totally wrong, but he again moved towards liberalism, and that's why he very rapidly lost popularity. The reason why he became popular was because during the debates he promised to preserve Iran's nuclear program and to remove the sanctions, and he didn't achieve those results. His administration was unable to do so, but they pursued, again, those sort of liberal policies, and I think that they created major problems for the country. Mr. Raisi, his popularity, and he is a popular political figure according to polls,
the current president of Iran.
Yes, the current president. Even though he's not the most charismatic, he's not, as a public speaker, he's not as good as Mr. Rouhani, he's not as good as Mr. Ahmadinejad, and he's not as good as Mr. Khatami, he's not as good as Mr. Rafsanjani. But he is seen as clean, and he's seen as someone who supports social justice. If Mr. Raisi succeeds in bringing about greater social justice, but in a more, let's say, scientific and in a more carefully considered manner than what Mr. Ahmadinejad was doing, then I would say that he will immensely strengthen Iranian institutions and create a great deal of support for his administration in the coming years, even though this can't happen overnight. If he doesn't move in that direction, or if he doesn't succeed in bringing about a better state of affairs for what is always the majority, and that is those who are either middle class or lower middle class, those who are disenfranchised, then I think he will be plagued with many problems. And his presidency, in my opinion, his success and failure will depend on how he treats that 60-65% of the people and how he is able to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor.
Dr. Sadiqi, would you like to add something before we close?
Well, it's just about the urban constructions that you mentioned. I wanted to say that it's probably because I come from Isfahan and not Tehran, and it's a more traditional city with a more citizen-friendly urban construction, and it is famous among the people in Isfahan and other cities that the municipality does a great job in maintaining the traditional outlook while also working on improving different, like civil services and constructions. That's maybe one reason that it never really looked to me as a major challenge or something that played a significant role. But I remember that's one thing that I wanted to mention, that the protests this year were very smaller in Isfahan than the ones in other cities, especially in Tehran or Rajt or other major cities, and they were smaller than the ones that happened in 2019, which erupted over fuel prices going high. And there were scenes where you could see downtown where there were historical sites and sites where people were come out and just have a picnic or just hang out with friends and families. There were scenes that you could see small gatherings of families doing shopping or eating out, and a few meters away from them, there were protests happening at the same time. This is something that you would never see, for example, in Tehran, because the urban construction is very different.
Thank you very much. It has been very informative encounter, really, and we are very happy to have you, and we hope that the conversation continues between scholars from different backgrounds to be able to understand and touch base on different topics of mutual interest. Dr. Sami?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sitara Sadiqi and Dr. Muhammad Marandi, for being part of this wonderful conversation. And also thank you, Dr. Hiba, for co-moderating and being part of this. And I hope, of course, that this conversation will continue in the future. I just want to end by saying that our next seminar would be a week from today, and it would be about Chinese political thought, the title of which is Of the People, For the People, but Not by the People, Confucian Meritocracy as a Correction of Democracy. This would be again a week from today. The speaker would be Professor Tongdong Bai from Fudan University in China. I also would like to remind everybody of our conference this week. It will start on Saturday, November the 5th, on Palestine, our third international conference on Palestine. And it is titled Our Vision for Liberation in Palestine. This is basically to further expand the authors who wrote chapters in a book with the same title. 19 of them would be presenting in this conference in 3 days, 3 o'clock Istanbul time, which is 12 noon GMT. It will also be live streamed, tune in, and you can also get these links on our website. Thank you very much, everyone.